positive information about the in-group and more negative information about the out-group. So basically, we see the group to which we belong, the in-group, as being different from the others, the out-group, and members of the same group as being more similar than they are. So even without any intergroup interaction, individuals begin to show favoritism towards their own group and negative reactions towards the out-group. So this conflict can result in prejudice, stereotypes, and of course, discrimination. Intergroup conflict can be highly competitive, especially for social groups with a long history of conflict. In contrast, intergroup competition can sometimes be relatively harmless, particularly in situations where there is little history of conflict, leading to relatively harmless generalizations and mild competitive behavior. So commonly, intergroup conflict is recognized amidst racial, ethnic, religious, and political groups. So the formation of intergroup conflict was investigated in a popular series of studies by Muzaffar Sherif and colleague in 1961 called the Robbers Cave Experiment. So the Robbers Cave Experiment was used to support realistic conflict theory. Muzaffar Sherif argued that intergroup conflicts occurs when two groups are in competition for limited resources. And other prominent theories relating to intergroup conflict include social dominance theory and social and self-categorization theory. Social dominance theory is a multi-level theory of how societies maintain group-based dominance. Nearly all stable societies can be considered group-based dominance hierarchies in which one social group, often an ethnic, religious, national, or racial one, holds disproportionate power and enjoys special privilege, and at least one other group has relatively little political power or is in its way of life. So it basically describes how processes at different levels of social organizations, from cultural ideologies and institutional discrimination to gender rules and the psychology of prejudice, work together to produce stable group-based inequality. It also states that a stable inequality among groups is maintained in part through the use of disproportionate force against subordinate groups. Next is the social identity theory and self-categorization theory. It suggests that people categorize themselves as belonging to certain groups such as nationality, gender, or even sports team. Social identity theory focuses on how group memberships guide intergroup behavior and influence an individual's self-concept. So closely tied to self-categorization, it is an individual's evaluation of the in-group. So to reach positive evaluations of one's own in-group, people engage in processes of social comparison. They derogate the out-group with the aim of increasing their own self-esteem. So self-categorization theory proposes that depending on salience in a situation, either personal identity and interpersonal behavior, social identity and intergroup behavior, or a dynamic interplay prevails. So before we jump into another topic, I will discuss the several strategies developed for reducing the tension, bias, prejudice, and conflict between social groups. So first we have here is the contact hypothesis or intergroup contact theory. So in 1954, Gordon Allport suggested that by promoting contact between groups, prejudice can be reduced. Further, he suggested 4 optimal conditions for contact: equal status between the groups in the situation, common goals, 6 intergroup cooperation, and the support of authorities, law, or customs. So since then, over 500 studies have been done on prejudice reduction under variation of the contact hypothesis, and a meta-analytic review suggests overall support for its efficacy. In some cases, even without the 4 optimal conditions outlined by Allport, prejudice between groups can be reduced. Next, we have the superordinate identities. Under the contract hypothesis, several models have been developed. A number of these models utilize a superordinate identity to reduce prejudice. That is a more broadly defined umbrella group identity that includes the groups that are in conflict. So by emphasizing this superordinate identity, individuals in both subgroups can share a common social identity. For example, if there is conflict between white, Black, and Latino students in high school, one might try to emphasize the high school group identity that students share to reduce conflict between the groups. Utilizing superordinate identities include the common in-group identity model, the in-group projection model, the mutual intergroup differentiation model, and the in-group identity model. Please take note of that. Last is the interdependence. So there are also techniques for reducing prejudice that utilize interdependence between two or more groups. That is, members across groups have to rely on one another to accomplish some goal or task. So despite strong evidence for the effectiveness of the jigsaw classroom, the strategy was not widely used, arguably because of strong attitudes existing outside of the schools, which still resisted the notion that racial and ethnic minority groups are equal to white and similarly should be integrated into schools. Next, we will discuss about what can we do about classroom dynamics. So to a large extent, a classroom dynamic is a product of its own context as defined both internally with the uniqueness of its members and externally in the cultural settings of the institution and the society in which it is located. So nevertheless, we can identify certain features and characterize useful classroom dynamics across most, so if not all contexts, even if these are represented by different behaviors according to the setting. So for example, the visible behaviors of cooperation in a Brazilian high school classroom might be different to those in a Dutch university or private evening class in Thailand, but cooperation remains key. So here are some aspects of classroom dynamics that a teacher may work to influence the chemistry of the group and make it more bonded. So the first is the cohesiveness of the class. Groups of people are very much brought together when they are aware of what they have in common. So shared experiences, values, and objectives lie at the heart of successful communities. As teachers, we can foster this awareness with activities that identify such commonalities and then use them to enhance learning. So in the webinar, we will look at practical language learning activities and teaching techniques that can develop a sense of community within a class. Next is the variety of interaction within a class. A class that has a flexible approach to how its members talk to each other is likely to have a more inclusive and therefore participative climate. So in the seminar, we will identify different modes of classroom talk, what each brings to learning, and how we can create a variety. And last, we have the amount of empathy class members have for each other. So successful group activities involve members compromising in order to support each other. So in the webinar, we will look at activities and practices that encourage peer support and greater sharing of learning within the group.